evening. Welcome to Potluck, your anything and everything talk show here in Northern Virginia. I'm your host, K. Patrick Glover, back in the studio here for the first time since the COVID pandemic began. And not gonna lie, it feels pretty good. Before we start this evening, just a sad note. A longtime friend of the program and former host, Eric Christopher Myers, recently passed away. Folklore was one of his favorite subjects, so we're dedicating tonight's show to Mr. Myers. My guest tonight, who you would have seen in Butterfly Kisses, produced by Eric, as well as other productions and on various programs, and the writer of Weird Maryland and Media Gothic, Mr. Matt Lake. Matt, welcome to Potluck.
Thank you, Glenn. It's great to be here.
So what we're going to talk about tonight are various myths and legends associated with Virginia. You're a folklore expert.
Sure enough.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and the weird books and what you're doing now with Media Gothic?
Well, I started out as a regular technology journalist and got sucked into editing Weird New Jersey, the book. And this was outside my normal sphere of what I'd worked with, but harken back to the stuff that I used to read in the early 70s. You know, there was UFOs, there was Bigfoot, there were ghosts, there were all these, like the laundry list of stuff that fascinated me as a preteen and early teenager was all in these books. And I came to it after a hiatus of probably almost 30 years, and it instantly gave me energy. It was a fantastic project. I wound up working on the weird books for the better part of 10 years, and applying sort of like that journalistic scrutiny to things like folklore, which are completely the antithesis of journalism. And that was a very pleasurable thing to do because I know what makes a good newspaper story. I know what makes a good journalistic sort of a work of non-fiction, and it's very satisfying to find something like folklore where none of those rules apply, and that's what makes these stories great.
Now, is the Media Gothic, which is your latest piece, is that spun off out of the weird books in some way, or is it a similar type of project?
It misses out with it's a very, very regional thing. It's what's more local, to tell you the truth. All the weird books were state-based. Right. So I had stories that were in Weird Virginia. I did Weird Maryland and Weird Pennsylvania, and they were very much focused on a larger region. Media Gothic is local. The media in the title has got nothing to do with the news media, mass media. It's the name of a town in the middle of Delaware County, and it's local history, and it's also with there's a hefty swath of ghost stories in there as well, because because people like ghost stories, and B, they form a part of history that is not the kind of thing that appears in newspapers.
Talking of ghost stories, in research for this program, I noticed that there were quite a few ghost stories settled here in Virginia, including one with Patrick Henry's wife.
Yes, there are. I should point out that ghost stories are not my strength, because I'm like ghost repellent. I go on ghost hunts, and I show up at these things, and there's almost a rolling of the eyes from the paranormal investigators because nothing ever happens when I'm there. The stories I dig a lot, I got to admit, but it's one of these things. There are also a lot of these stories that I don't really like that much. Ghost stories tend to lend themselves to a lot of fabrication, and there is something about ghost stories that I like to apply a journalistic sense to. I don't like having neatly tied up stories, and there is a tendency for people in ghost stories to say, this happened, this person died, and that's why there is a ghost. And I don't think it's usually that
cut and dry.
Cut and dried, exactly.
Well, let's talk about something a little more realistic. Let's talk about the werewolf. What can you tell us about the werewolf here in Virginia?
Werewolf stories have a long and storied tradition going back to the Greeks and beyond. But there is a local story of a werewolf that is. It's based around a recreation centre around here, where people, have seen a creature, like a wolf. It looks like your classic wolfman kind of a thing. And when stories like this come in, sometimes you get people who culture jam. You get people who wear costumes and try to get seen so that they can make a story. And there is some degree to which people are saying, well, so it's clearly just someone in a Halloween costume. This is in Henrico County, and it's a recreation centre out there where this has been spotted. And
how long ago are we talking about? When was it first spotted?
It was pretty recent. It's within this century, certainly. It doesn't have a massive history going back. A lot of the stuff, if it's been going around for 100 or so years, that's an established legend. This is much more recent, and in the case of a werewolf type of a sighting, I kind of appreciate that. It's like a migratory creature almost. Your werewolf. There's a supernatural element to them, but. The other great thing about this werewolf story is that people think, well, it's clearly not a werewolf, because werewolves, they don't exist. It's obviously Bigfoot, and Bigfoot, of course, does exist. I know a lot of people who investigate Bigfoot, and these are environmental science people.
Now, isn't there supposed to be a Bigfoot sightings here in Virginia as well?
I'm not sure about Virginia proper. There's certainly one in West Virginia, and a number of them in Maryland, just north. And here's the thing: I mean, you get random sightings. There are people who track these things. There are online databases of people who track these things. And then there are people. There's a fellow out in Harford County, Maryland, a fellow called Bob Chance, who was the mayor, I think, of Bel Air at one point in the 70s, environmental science teacher, and he had an encounter without actually seeing Bigfoot. He was one of these.
How does that work?
He was a ranger. He was taking a group of students out into the wild, and it was. He heard loud noises and loud animal noises, and things being thrown, and sort of like rocks being thrown in their direction out of the woods, and that, to an environmental science teacher, that is classic primate defensive behaviour. You don't see an animal in the woods because the animal in the woods doesn't want to be seen. They don't want to come out into the open and attack you in case you're a stronger predator. So they do these, it's like Zulu shield beating. They make a lot of noise and they throw stuff and you don't know where they're coming from.
Like howler monkeys.
Exactly, yeah. Exactly, the howler monkey, that's a noise. They're terrifying things. I think, you see
I've seen howler monkeys live, yeah.
That's primate behavior. And there are no large known official primates in the woods of Virginia or Maryland or anywhere on the East Coast or West Coast for that matter. But the cryptid, the creature that is not zoologically official, but which has been seen and there's evidence there. People track. Sort of, this is exactly the kind of thing that people used to see in Borneo and Sumatra before they discovered the orangutan, And so there is this beautiful thing about Bigfoot where it is it tracks, the storyline is exactly like the storyline of when they discovered some of the larger primates like mountain gorillas and orangutans, some of the great apes. It was exactly that kind of thing that people saw before they actually found the creatures, and there's something very appealing, particularly with the deforestation, the asphaltization of the United States, that there might be a creature out there still that is a large primate.
Okay.
staying hidden on the fringes.
We're a general talk show, so we have a very general audience.
Okay.
For people who aren't familiar with it, explain the term cryptid.
Oh, cryptid is cryptid. It comes from the Greek word, from which we get crypt. A crypt is a hidden place. A cryptid and cryptozoology is the study of animals that are hidden. So they are these classic creatures like
Loch Ness
Bigfoot,
Monster.
Loch Ness Monster, the Chessie of the Chesapeake Bay, Sasquatch or Bigfoot. These types of creature. West Virginia, there's the Mothman and so forth. But there are, that's what I mean by cryptid, and they are. It's an interesting branch of. It's almost like the amateur scientist. It's the last reserve of the amateur scientist rather than a real, sort of specialist. Right. Which it appeals to my sense of history and my admiration for early science. Before it got codified.
So, would the Bunny Man qualify as a cryptid?
Would the Bunny Man? Actually, not really. The Bunny Man, a great Fairfax story. There is a bridge, and this is classic folklore. There is a bridge where people go. They do this legend tripping. They go there at night. Usually, maybe they've had a drink or two, maybe they haven't. They go there to seek the thrill. There is a story that there is a man there, and the stories, which again is classic folklore. There are a bunch of different stories. In some cases, the Bunny Man is called the Bunny Man because they find, in some of the stories rather, because there are like rabbit pelts that have been left, bloodied rabbit pelts that have been strewn around the place. And the story attached to those Bunny Man, not sightings, but those Bunny Man events, are that there was an asylum that was transporting people in the early 1900s. This is where this particular branch of the legend comes from, and several of these inmates that were being transported from one asylum to another escaped and lived out in the wild and were dangerous. And the stories throughout the early part of the 20th century were, and once again, I don't have any documentary evidence that these stories were told. These are stories that I found out in this century, 100 years later, and I had difficulty in finding that branch, any verification of that branch of the story. Stuff that is well documented by news outlets and by folklore study. Starts in the 1970s. In 1970, there was a literal sighting of somebody. He was the sighting was, it was a couple that was parking out in the woods, and it was a soldier. The year was 1970, and he was in the area for the Army-Navy Games, and he was parked in a quiet place with his fiancée, and somebody dressed in a rabbit costume came in and screamed at them that you're on private property through the open windows of the car, and tossed a hatchet into the car, which fortunately missed them both, but they beat a hasty retreat. And that was a news story in 1970. And over the next couple of years, there was this ripple effect. It started at the Bunny Man Bridge, Fairfax, right here, right where we're very near where we're filming now. And there was this ripple effect that went around pretty much the entire beltway of people seeing either copycat cases of. It became very popular. This Bunny Man with a hatchet. So people would dress up in. The assumption was that there were people who dressed up in like a big Halloween costume, or right. One of those fluffy bunny things from the Christmas Story, and went around with a hatchet to be seen. And there was a study made in 1973 out of the University of Maryland, which had a fantastic folklore department. And I was looking over like oral histories, and there was one study that was done by an undergraduate, I think for a thesis, who collected dozens of these oral histories. Mm-hmm. And in these towns, it was almost like it was rippling out from Fairfax. There would be children who ran screaming. There were panics that went through schoolyards during recess because someone saw the bunny man, and these kids would be like falling over each other to get into the classroom and duck and cover.
Was this just bored parents in rabbit costumes? Or?
Well, having worked in schools with primary school, elementary school students, when they're ignoring you, the temptation will be so great. It's like, there's the bunny man, and everyone gets in after recess. But no, these were fairly legit panic stories of this, the whispering history of this creature. So the bunny man falls into two separate stories where people hear the term bunny man and then they just make up a story around it. And that's legit folklore. It's terrible journalism, but it's legit folklore. And I favour what I've got an audit trail of. And there's a written history of people taking down oral records of the bunny man in the bunny costume with a hatchet. And when we wrote this thing up for the Weird book series, there was a story in Weird, Virginia, and there's this model in there in this pink bunny suit on railroad tracks with a hatchet, and it makes for a great visual. And I'm absolutely convinced inspired the really creepy bunny in Donnie Darko. I can't think of any other reason for a man bunny.
See, I'm sitting here thinking about I think it was actually a moth suit, but it looked like a bunny suit in The Tick.
Oh, right.
The old cartoon.
Yeah, it's a deflator mouse.
Yes.
I wasn't. Yeah. So there was. Yeah, that part of the Bunnyman stuff I really like, and of course, I almost got crushed at an Echo and the Bunnyman concert. So I feel a great affinity for the Bunnyman.
Okay, so we got werewolves. We've got giant killer bunnies with hatchets.
Sure.
Do we also have vampires?
Of course, there are always vampires.
Tell me about the vampires.
I'll tell you about the vampires. Vampirism was vampires in like really old traditions, old oral traditions, back in the old world. They were more like what we would consider zombies. But they were flesh eaters, okay. And they feasted on sort of humans, and they were these ghoulish, like half monsters. The Christopher Lee, Bela Lugosi, sexy vampire.
The Bram Stoker stuff.
The Bram Stoker stuff was inspired by, in a very real way, it was inspired by Lord Byron. It was
the summer where Mary Shelley created Frankenstein, and Dr. Polidori did the vampire?
Dr. Polidori did the vampire. And that was the first record that I know of where the vampire was a suave, debonair, sexual predator, I guess, but sort of like had an influence over the women.
For those unfamiliar with the story, that was a kind of a wild weekend at Lord Byron's place in the early 1800s, with Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, right. His wife Mary Shelley, who would go on to write Frankenstein, and Dr. Polidori, and they challenged each other to write ghost stories?
Yeah. Oh, it was, this is exactly the setting, but there's another layer on top of it, which was that over the other side of the world, there had been a volcanic eruption. And this get-together that they had was, they were shut in. Because it was called the year with no summer, because the volcanic dust that went into the atmosphere went all across the globe and created these incredibly dramatic skies and electrical storms. And it was the perfect setting for a Gothic novel. And when they were all stuck in this halfway up a mountain, with these lashing rainstorms with electrical flashings. Galvani had started doing things like animating dead muscles with electricity. So galvanism, in the electrical, right. Scientific sense, that was in the news at the time. So you can just imagine this, this summer that was dark and like stormy, and these like four really creative people trying to pull stories together. And best of it is the two professional writers, they gave up their project. Mary Shelley, who was really young at the time, she was 17 years old or something, and this Dr. Polidori, they made genres. I mean, this recreation of dead, reanimation of dead tissue was Mary Shelley's contribution, and Polidori did this this predator story of a human that was a seducer, really, and sucked blood, literally, sort of like sucked the blood out of people, and that was in the early 1800s, and at that point, this image. There were other vampire stories that came afterwards in the Penny Dreadfuls. Varney the Vampire was a very famous example of that. But this really seeped into the popular culture, and where previously it was witches. Witchcraft was the big thing throughout the Middle Ages, all the way up through the 1700s. Witchcraft and witchcraft trials that was the big bugaboo. If someone died, they put a cage over it because they were witches. They put a cage over the grave. Right. From the early 1800s onwards, it was like vampires. Witchcraft was old hat in terms of being a threat. Vampirism was the big threat, and in the New World there were.
So it was a widely spread belief. It wasn't just.
It was, and it was fed by that popular, the popular culture stuff.
Right.
But all these other legends came into play. It changed the idea of what a vampire was.
So what about our local vampire here in Virginia?
The local vampire, it was based on a really kind of a sad story about a bridge, a tunnel that collapsed and people died in it. Following this great disaster, there were sightings of like bloody individuals that were supposed to be people who had been pulled out of the wreckage, but something had happened in the tunnel. There's this great thing with tunnels are great for engendering legends. They really are. Yeah, the Bunnyman Bridge is a tunnel type of a bridge, and when you go into this dark thing, and it was an engineering disaster, is what it was. This tunnel collapsed and several people died in it. But when they dragged it out, it was like there was a supernatural vibe from having been in this tunnel, that they had somehow been infected by something in there, and that at least one of them had come back from that experience as a supernatural being. And the setting of this was I think it was late 1800s that this story came from, and no, it was 1920s. Beg your pardon, it was the 1920s, and at that point, vampirism was very much in the news, because although it was another few years before the movie of Dracula came out,
right.
It was several years after the first movie about vampirism, which was Nosferatu,
the German silent picture.
They couldn't use the name Dracula in there because Dracula was a copyrighted term. Right. The Bram Stoker estate was very fierce about retaining copyright. They were one of the early. He was one of the early heroes of copyright protection. Because it was relatively easy to do, and he fiercely prosecuted, and his heirs fiercely prosecuted. So anyway, even though Dracula wasn't out yet, Nosferatu was, and there was a legit stage play version of Dracula kicking about at the time. So vampirism was very much in the public eye at the time. And vampires are they're just cool. Let's not deny it. There's something very threatening about it. Something very relatable about this charismatic, hypnotic figure that will tear you apart given half a chance.
So, where was the local vampire located here?
Oh heavens, that's a really good question. I may have to refer to my notes. Was that Churchill? Yeah, it was Churchill.
Okay.
So it was, yeah, it's really not far from here. It was a railroad kind of an arrangement. It happened, as I said, in 1925.
Do we still get sightings of the vampire?
No, I don't think we do. It's kind of sad. It would be nice if they did. But 100 years on, and sort of, in a lot of cases, the stories tend to, unless they're real perennials, there aren't. People still go out looking for this, but I think the Bunnyman basically supplanted the vampire in terms of culture jamming, because I think Fairfax Tunnel was easier to get to, and so forth.
We're about out of time for our talk here today. Folks, don't worry, Matt will be back. Matt will be back with us next time, where we will talk about the lost colony of Roanoke. In the meantime, your books are available where?
They're available on classic bookstore outlets, bookstore.org, and of course that other one, the one with the
smiley face online. And as well, in addition to the book from Media Gothic, you are also doing tours in Media, Pennsylvania.
This is true.
Tell us briefly about your tours.
Well, on the reg, we have I and my writing partner Laurie Hull take groups around. It's a very short walk because I'm lazy, and it hits all the high spots of the dark history and the folklore of this town that was built in the 1850s, and which is currently the county seat of Delaware County, PA. And there's explosions, there's ghosts, there's guns, there's all kinds of creepy things.
Old asylums?
Actually, yes, there is.
Yes, there was.
There is, yeah.
I have been on this tour.
I'd actually forgotten about that. It's an elementary school now, but it's where the asylum used to be.
All right, folks. Thanks for coming back to Potluck with us. You're home for anything and everything here in Northern Virginia. We will be back next week. In the meantime, stay safe out there.